are a few of my favorite things.
Table saw jigs can make difficult operations much easier, such as when cutting tapers and table legs. Or they can make repetitive operations much more efficient and repeatable, such as when making a batch of identical parts. Jigs can also make inherently unsafe operations, such as cutting thin strips, much safer. The 2 wine racks sitting on my table saw were part of a batch of 5 I made some time ago. I wanted to make them as a small production run, so I made a number of jigs to help in the manufacture and assembly of the parts. One of the jigs was used on the table saw to cut backs and sides of the racks all to the proper length with minimal setup. I will demonstrate that jig, and later we'll show you a number of my other favorite jigs. The first thing I do when using a jig on my sliding table is to make sure that the miter gauge fence is square to the blade. I rest a square on the blade body between the teeth, as the carbide blade tips are wider than the blade body. I want to make sure that the square edge is resting flat and parallel to the plane of the blade. Now that the sliding table fence is square to the blade, I place the jig on the table. But before clamping it to the miter gauge fence, I make sure it is registered properly by placing it on a mark I have scored on the surface of the table saw that represents the left cutting edge of the blade. This way I get consistent results every time I use the jig. When making 5 wine racks, I would stack the 10 sides, and because the rack is split into 2, the 20 fronts and backs next to the jig. I would place them against the appropriate jig fence one at a time and push the jig past the blade. The parts are quickly cut to a consistent length. The fronts and backs would already have had their tops cut to a 45-degree angle in a miter saw before cutting them to length using this jig. Let's suppose I want to taper this board. Now this is just a piece of scrap MDF for demonstration purposes. But I've drawn a line here. Let's suppose I want the taper to start there. And I want to taper down the board, and ultimately at the bottom I want it to be this thin. So what I would do is take a straight edge from the point where I want to start and the final width, draw a line. Carefully draw a line. So that the end board will come out and be tapered into the shape. Well, for this task I would call upon my trusty tapering jig. Basically it consists of hardboard on top, up a piece of plywood. It has a fence over here. I've got these 2 hold down clamps. And then it also has a runner on the back, a hardwood runner, that fits into the wire slot of the saw. I use this to taper that board. The simplest way I've found to set this jig up is first set it on the edge. Take the board, like you see the line, use a couple of clamps, clamp in place. So here I have the line crossing the edge of the jig where I want it to end. And then have that line flush all the way across the jig. Now once I have the stock clamped to the jig, I lay it down, and then I'm going to use these combination of a stop and a clamp to hold it in the position I want and hold it tight to the jig. Usually I don't take these apart, but I did this to demonstrate. This lower part is a stop that I can slide along, and what I want to do is just slide it up again and then tighten it down with this little handle. Then take this clamp and since this jig was designed to work with stock a little thicker than this 1/4 inch board, I'm going to use this little block to help tighten it down. So I just tighten it down like that, and then I do the same over here. Now once I've got that fastened down, I can remove these clamps. And the reason for the separate stop and the clamp is that once I cut this stock I can loosen the clamps, remove it, and put another board in against the stops without having moved them, and I can make that part identical to the one I just cut. So let me demonstrate how this works. This is a jig for cutting precise wedges for making segmented bowls on a lathe. I will do an actual demo with this jig in the lathe video, but for now I will just identify the piece parts. This is the sled, which is secured to the sliding table fence. The sled itself has two fences for setting the angle of cut of the wedges. These must be set precisely or else you won't get a perfect circle. I purchased these wedges that are cut to an exact angle for making 10, 16, 24, 32, and 48 segment rings. The wedges are used to set the sled fences. This is a stop that determines how wide each wedge will be when it is cut. You can have a 10 segment ring that has a very small diameter or a very large diameter depending upon how wide each segment is. With the segment jig, you can produce various sized wedges that are glued together to form rings. Then the rings are glued together to form a turning blank, which is turned on a lathe to create a segmented bowl or vessel. I originally made this tenoning jig for my contractor saw, but even though there was more space between the miter slot and the blade on this saw, it still fit. A tenoning jig is used to safely cut boards vertically on a table saw, such as the cheeks of a tenon. The jig has a vertical face attached to a horizontal board that slides on a base. Attached to the face of the jig is a fence that is used to square up the material to be cut. On occasion, I have also mounted fences at 45 degrees in order to cut splines and miter joints. The base has two tracks on it. Runners on the horizontal board slide in the tracks to adjust the jig's distance from the blade. The handle locks it into place. There's also a runner on the base which slides in the table saw's miter slot. This is to allow the jig to remain parallel to the blade as you slide it through the miter slot, thereby pushing the material through the blade in order for it to be cut. I've laid out a tenon on a piece of MDF to demonstrate the tenoning jig. The first thing I do is to adjust the blade height for the length of the tenon. I line up the tooth at the apex of the blade to my mark. I align the board with the fence on the jig and secure it with a clamp. Next, I loosen the knob and slide the top part of the jig so that the blade aligns with the tenon cheek nearest the camera. Tighten the knob and we're ready for the first cut. You can see how precarious it would be to try to push a narrow, tall board like this through the blade using the table saw fence, even if it was augmented with a tall fence. The jig fence also serves as a backer board to reduce tear out during the cut. Since the tenon was laid out to be centered within the thickness of the board, I can simply flip it around and repeat the cut for the other cheek. Both cuts are exactly the same length. Actually, I'm done with the jig, but to complete the tenon, I need to remove the waste on both cheek cuts. To do this, I install the miter gauge and lower the blade to the thickness of the waist. I carefully set the miter gauge stop so that the shoulder of the tenon will exactly meet the cheek cuts. Then I cut one side, and eventually the other. When the cuts are completed, voila, a perfectly centered tenon. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at a few of my favorite table saw jigs. That's it for now, and I'll see you at B&O.